Harry Potter.
The Harry Potter books are a legitimate cultural force. I don't think I have to tell you how popular they are. I love them myself. The film series is equally popular, but I have a bone to pick with those movies. I recognize an interesting phenomenon in entertainment criticism when it comes to these films. In just about every review that I've read or watched about these movies, each film is compared to the corresponding book. Now that can take the form of a critic lamenting that the movie didn't show a part of the book that they liked, or a critic bemoaning the fact that the film adaptations won't match what they saw in their own imagination when they read the book. A consequence of this kind of comparison that manifests itself almost universally throughout critics is that each film is not taken on its own merit. It will always be taken in comparison to the book that shares its title. I think this is an extreme disservice to the people that made these films, and since it's been over 10 years since this series began, I think it's high time someone gave these movies the criticism they deserve. Welcome, dear viewer, to Presented in Technicolor's Harry Potter Review Series.
Wicked.
I knew Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone was going to be my biggest hurdle in this review series, and that is exactly what it turned out to be. The main problem with Sorcerer's Stone is that, after the first viewing, you start to notice how incredibly boring it is. The movie clocks in at an incredibly lengthy 2.5 hours, which means that what's on screen better be damn interesting to keep the audience engaged. The movie fails spectacularly in this regard, and I'll tell you exactly why. This movie is one of the least visually stimulating children's movies I have ever seen. Here's what I mean. Take a look at good children's fantasy movies like The Wizard of Oz, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, The Goonies, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, The Princess Bride, or practically any of the Muppet movies. What they have, and what Sorcerer's Stone doesn't, is production designed for kids. Those movies knew who their audience was. Sorcerer's Stone didn't. You can tell from all parts of the film. Take, for example, the production design in a movie like Willy Wonka. There are impossible-looking structures and sets. Everything has this otherworldly quality to it. Now look at Sorcerer's Stone. Everyone is wearing the same thing, and everything looks very ordered and neat. Look at all of the right angles used in set construction. Right angles are the most boring thing to look at. This is why one can be bored watching a movie about kids learning magic and having adventures in an enchanted castle. Everything looks so day-to-day and ordinary. There's no sense of whimsy whatsoever. Okay, that's kind of a lie. There were a couple of parts where the movie forgot how boring it was supposed to be and then became visually interesting. I can only presume that this was an accident. Gringotts Bank and Diagon Alley are both very interesting looking locations. Hagrid's hut is another one, and the same can be said about the giant chessboard. But what do all of these locations have in common? They're all very sparse on their use of right angles, and they all have a messiness to them that is starkly different from the order that is found in the rest of the Hogwarts locations. The parts of the film in Muggle England should look boring, not the magical world. This actually makes it very frustrating watching this movie because of the potential for truly whimsical and wondrous sets. This is a movie about wizards in modern-day Britain, and it looks about as boring as a particularly dry documentary about British students in a castle.
Now, if you two don't mind, I'm going to bed before either of you come up with another clever idea to get us killed, or worse, expelled.
She needs to sort out her priorities.
The dull visuals aren't just limited to sets, however. The costumes in this movie are just flat out awful, with very few exceptions. I find it hard to believe that this movie was nominated for both Best Art Direction and Best Costume Design at the Academy Awards. The biggest problem with the costumes is that they all look the same. Not just some of the time, but all the time. Harry and his friends are hardly ever out of their school uniforms, and they're always impeccably dressed. This ventures into what I call the Omen syndrome. That's when young characters are dressed in outfits that are way too formal for their age, as exhibited in the horror film The Omen. The result is that the audience is always vaguely creeped out by the kid because he's not allowed to be a kid. Think back to good children's fantasy movies like The Goonies. All of the kids in that film wore costumes that felt very personal and reflected their character. In Sorcerer's Stone, you get none of that reflection of personality because everyone wears the same thing all the time. Even lounging around, they're always superbly dressed. Over Christmas break, Harry hangs around the castle wearing khakis and an old person sweater. What kind of 11-year-old willingly wears that stuff? I mean, look at this costume that Harry's cousin Dudley is wearing. It looks like he's getting ready to play piano at an old-timey saloon. What kind of a person will wear that, let alone a young kid? And don't start telling me that it's a British thing, because I've been there and I never once saw anyone wearing that. The sad thing is, this really is one of the most interesting costumes to look at in the whole movie, and the dumbass cousin Dudley gets to wear it. Why is a muggle's costume more interesting to look at than the witches and wizards? It makes no sense.
Daddy's gone mad, hasn't he?
So now this all begs the question, who is at fault for this? The first person I blamed was the production designer, Stuart Craig, who was responsible for how everything looked on screen. But through a little more research, I found out that Craig was also the production designer for all of the rest of the Harry Potter films, some of which look absolutely fantastic. So it can't be his fault, since he was such a big part of making those other movies look great. Where does the blame go, then? The answer, dear viewer, is squarely on the shoulders of director Chris Columbus, who is responsible for all of the style choices in the film. Columbus seems to be most comfortable making movies about extraordinary things happening in ordinary life, like in Home Alone. He doesn't seem to be very imaginative when it comes to visually portraying something whimsical on screen, which is odd considering that his early successes were as the writer for films like The Goonies and Gremlins. I know I've been saying this a lot, but all of it adds up to being so very boring. The only interesting visuals are the sets I mentioned earlier and the teachers' costumes. Those are all very well done and reflect the personality of the character wearing them. This makes it all so sad, seeing the students in costumes that are so mundane and without any variation whatsoever. Now that I mentioned the teachers, I think it's finally time to praise this film for something: the adult actors. Let's run down the Great British Actor checklist, shall we? We have Alan Rickman, Robbie Coltrane, Richard Harris, John Cleese, Maggie Smith, Warwick Davis, and John Hurt. These actors and actresses are all superb in their roles and are the real highlights of this film. Sadly, they can't save Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone from its tedious runtime and stale set and costumes. The largest difference between a book and a movie in general are the visuals, and to see the visuals fail so incredibly in this case means that you should probably skip this movie if you can. If you need to see it for the continuity of the series, then rent it once and then never subject yourself to it again. You'll thank me later. 2 out of 4 stars for the first viewing, 1 out of 4 stars if you ever see it again.